One of these days, I'm going to pick a topic. I'm going to do some research on it. I'm going to record a single podcast on it. And there won't be any fascinating digressions that catch my attention or threads that I pull on that turn into several other episodes. And it'll just be a neat, nicely contained single topic that I do, and then it's over. But today is not that day. Yeah, I'm probably kidding. There's probably never going to be a day when I don't just get obsessed and fascinated with whatever I'm talking to you guys about, because that's kind of what makes me love the Western canon. What drives me so insane in a good way is that anything I pick up to talk about, any book I decide to introduce you to, any concept I want to explore with you, I always find that when you turn over that rock, there's just an enormous network of ideas and thoughts to share that are relevant to everything that's going on with us right now. A couple weeks ago, I started talking about Novalis and just wanted to tell you about this one 30-page long essay that I had really been struck by and introduce it to you so that you would have it in your arsenal of things you know about in the Western canon. And lo and behold, this sent me on an enormous journey through the history of basically everything and the theory of the medieval Renaissance. And that's the kind of thing that really just brings me joy about this show. I hope it brings you joy too, that no element of the Western canon, if it's truly great, if it truly deserves inclusion in the canon, no element stands alone. It's all networked, it's all connected. There's not some crazy conspiracy. It really is true that all human knowledge can be connected in a network and a web. And that's what's happened to me now as I've been talking to you about the domestication of the pagan gods. I started out with this one question, which is, how did Dr. Fauci become like a secular priest? And how did the science become a sort of religion? And this sent me back into the history of what's called euhemerism, and a pagan but also Christian answer to the ubiquity of the gods, the fact that there are always all these sort of repetitions in the various different civilizations that have pantheistic pantheons, that, you know, you get Venus in Greek culture, but you also get Ishtar in Babylon, and you also get Hathor in Egypt. And why is it that mankind throughout its history has repeatedly intuited or experienced these entities in the world that are higher than human beings, but not supreme gods, these consciousnesses that seem to operate in the world? And one explanation for that is that the pagan gods are real, but another explanation is euhemerism, which is that there's some natural cause behind it. Maybe these were people that got deified, but most importantly for us, maybe these are just ways of describing, allegorical ways of describing the natural world, things like the sun and the moon and the stars. And the reason that's important for us is that this was explicitly one explanation that people like Francis Bacon during the scientific revolution were giving for the pagan myths, especially Greek and Roman antiquity, but also more generally what was sometimes called the Prisca Theologia, the original theology that everybody everywhere kind of has this natural sense of the divine imbued in nature, but it gets corrupted maybe by Ham, the evil, wicked son of Noah. Somehow through Egypt and on into these other pantheons, you get a kind of demonic perversion of what was supposed to be this rational, pure connection to the divine, and that's how you get pagan mythology. But importantly, says Bacon and some of the other guys that talk about this stuff, even these corrupted forms of pagan mythology have these sort of shadows of the truth in them. So that now, as the light of reason dawns again, and we're in this Christendom kind of culture that takes the Christian God for granted, we can do science and find a rational, true, exact description of all the forces that were contained in the pagan myths. And Bacon writes this whole series of essays about this in 1609, in which he says, for example, that the fable of Cupid, the idea that love was present at the dawn of creation, is actually just an intimation of the forces that attract atoms to one another, which hold the world together. And so science becomes explicitly a kind of secular version of the pagan myths, but not entirely secular, because it takes place under the banner of Christianity. This is a development that happens within Christian Europe. And it's important that it happens that way because that means people already have a religion. They don't need science to be a substitute religion. They don't need pagan mythology to explain the human experience of the numinous, the transcendent, the divine. They can refer that to the truths of the Christian faith and to Scripture. But what I said last week is when Christianity recedes from the world, when Christendom loses its Christian faith, which is sort of what's happened now in our culture as it becomes increasingly post-Christian, then you don't have a place to put your worship anymore. And mankind is a naturally worshiping animal. We have intuitively, as part of our baseline experience of the world, we sense that there is more in it than just us, that the logic we have in our minds and the forms and structures that we have in our mind correspond to a grander order in the world. And this leads us to worship, to seek some higher consciousness or meaning or answer in the world besides our own. And if we don't have a God outside of nature, then we're going to turn to seek for something to worship. And the most natural place for us to go is back into the natural world, back into the world that science describes, because explicitly that was what science was always doing. It was describing the same things as the pagan myths, but in these natural, physical, materialist terms. And now that everything is material and we have nowhere to worship, we've imbued material life and physical science and technology with a kind of religious awe, with a sort of fervor and respect and just veneration that we would otherwise apply to our gods and to our religion. And that is how science and technology starts to take on the character of pagan worship and pagan myth. And it helps explain this kind of eerie phenomenon, which I now want to turn to talking about, where you'll hear people talking in the year of our Lord, 2023, in the modern world, and they'll talk in these ways that are ostensibly materialist, about things that are supposed to be just these purely rational physical things, just like Francis Bacon would have wanted, like physics and the science and epidemiology and doctors and all this stuff. And they'll be saying words that in their literal meaning are just material, just physical. But in the way that people are talking, it sounds as if they are pagan worshippers. They're talking about these material processes in these kind of reverential, worshipful ways. And this, I think, is nicely explained by the fact that we are now transposing our religious impulses back into the natural world where they originally began, and when the world was all pagan. And I've never done this before, but I feel like I have to coin a term. I have to come up with a word for this phenomenon. And it's not usually my thing. Some people are really into inventing new words as part of the intellectual exercise. It's not something I've ever done before. It's my first time, long-time listener, first-time caller. But I've come up with an invented word to describe what I'm talking about here. And the word is allegregores. Allegregores, allegregores. And let me explain what this is. It's a portmanteau, which is where you smash two words together. It's a combination of two different words. And the first word is egregore. So an egregore is already kind of an obscure term that you may or may not have heard of. It's an entity, a being, that has no natural existence of its own, but comes into existence through a kind of collective mind virus or brain experiment, or just the group belief, a general group belief creates and brings into being an entity that has kind of its own existence. So an example that is given in Meditations on the Tarot, a book I'm pretty interested in, is the Antichrist. The idea that the Antichrist kind of isn't himself a natural entity, but he comes into existence as everybody kind of bows down to this satanic logic. There is a sort of shadow spirit that emerges out of this groupthink. But more kind of, I don't know, harmless or gentle examples of egregores would be Christmas, right? There's no such thing as Christmas without people doing Christmas and believing in Christmas. But now that we all do, and that there is this group belief and way of talking about it, there is kind of a character all its own to Christmas. Christmas kind of takes on a life of its own. You can talk about the Christmas spirit. Santa Claus could even be an egregore. And this concept is very powerful now that we have this online culture where people will adopt these sort of reflexive communal ways of talking about things. So this is an egregore, right? A viral meme could be an egregore if it takes on a life or a character of its own. What is an allegregore? So an allegregore is when an allegory, an allegorical way of talking, takes on a life of its own as if it were literal. And you start to see this in the return of this pagan way of talking. So the science would be a good example of an allegregore, because really when we say the science, we think we're speaking allegorically. We don't believe there's such a thing as science with a heart and a mind that wants things, that commands certain things of us. But during COVID, people started to talk in this kind of creepy way so that their allegorical way of talking didn't really feel so allegorical, like it felt more literal, and the science started to take on kind of this divine character. And I think that the pagan gods and the new way that we have of talking about material science as if it were a kind of pagan god is an allegregore, where people think they're talking allegorically, but at a certain point it becomes hard to tell whether the allegory or the supposed literal interpretation is more real. And I think about this when I hear people talk about, is it a mental illness or is it demonic possession? So you'll hear people talk about their mental illnesses, like I have this depression, this anxiety that haunts me, and they'll say it's like a demon, right? It's as if I'm tormented by something from outside. And you start to think, well, okay, is it like a demon or is it actually a demon? And is there really a difference? Like at a certain point, are we describing the same thing as our texts, our ancient texts describe when we talk about demonic possession, just using this materialist language that we're more comfortable with? But is the materialist language a metaphor for the demon, or is the demon a metaphor for the material reality? That's what I mean when I'm talking about an allegregore. And so what I want to do now, and this kind of wormhole that I've fallen down in thinking about this, is I want to observe a series of allegregores that I think are starting to kind of raise their heads as like new replacements for the pagan gods. And today I'm going to focus on maybe the most obvious and the most stark example of this, and that is the reappearance of Mother Nature. You've all heard the concept of Mother Nature. In fact, we grew up with it so naturally that we might not even think of it as a sort of mode of pagan worship. But actually, if you imagine what we mean when we talk about Mother Nature, we think this is a metaphor. We think this is an allegory, right? That this is something which we use to talk about certain trends in the environment, certain natural forces like gravity, but also combustion and atmospheric pressure. And when you bundle all of that together, all of our knowledge about the natural world, all of the supposedly rationalist and mechanistic and spontaneous processes that generate our natural environment, we get this package of thoughts and ideas that we find it convenient to describe under the heading of Mother Nature. And it's as if we have this kind of character, this person or this entity that gives us all birth, that supports and sustains our life, that provides us with nourishment and food, and perhaps also asks things of us, like that we respect the planet and the trees and the earth. And this is a modern way of talking that has a kind of naturally mythological character, right? Mother Nature wants this. Mother Nature is doing this or that. And we think this is an allegory. But what I want to suggest is it's actually an allegregore. It's actually an ironic way of backing into a very ancient mode of thought about the natural world as if it were an avenging deity with demands of us and desires for sacrifice. And I'm going to give some examples of how this works in the modern world, but first I want to talk about Mother Nature throughout history and time, in the ancient world and in the canon and in the tradition, because one of the points of thinking about stuff from the perspective of the ancient world, of antiquity and classics and so forth, is to realize that the things we think of as sort of modern anomalies, these weird, hyper-modern ways of thinking, are often not all that modern at all, but have a continuity and a through line with our history so that the wisdom of the past can be relevant to the modern day, to the present. And when it comes to the idea of Mother Nature, on the one hand, we can associate it with like the hippie movement and with the modern environmentalist movement, but we also know that this goes way, way back to the roots of pagan mythology. And in fact, it is one of the most primitive and natural forms of pagan worship. We can find it in what we would think of as the high classical civilizations like Greece and Rome, but we can also find it sort of roundabout elsewhere because it's one of the most basic human experiences. And when I say basic, I don't mean this primitive materialist idea that we have. We have this kind of silly modern notion that primitive man, cavemen in his natural state, cavemen weren't actually all that religious, or they weren't spiritual. They might have been religious, but they didn't have our sophisticated ideas of like God as spirit or whatever. But we know, in fact, in reality, that from the very earliest examples we have of human civilization, mankind seems deeply convinced in this kind of primal way that the world is more than just debris and physical objects, that actually there are characters, spirits in the world, and Mother Nature is one of the most immediate and obvious spirits that mankind has ever encountered. And if you think about this in purely rational terms, if you insist on kind of a materialist account, this makes perfect sense, right? Because we were all born onto the earth, the same planet sustains us all, and it does produce our food, like plants come up out of it, and rain falls down to nourish us, and all this stuff. And of course, the Christian account of this is because God created the earth to be our home. But if you don't have that account, then the most natural account is that the earth itself is a kind of spirit or a kind of character that gave birth to us. And so as soon as there's religion, basically, which seems to be as soon as there's people, there's earth worship. It's one of the most basic and obvious human religious intuitions. It might even be attested in the Linear B tablets. Now, this is very, very sketchy, and your mileage really may vary, but I think it's worth mentioning just because of its sort of spooky, suggestive power. Linear B is a script that is named because it comes after Linear A, and they're both called linear because that distinguishes them from other early forms of writing, that they are written in a line, right? They are linear, and they're found on what is now the island that is now Crete. And Linear A is associated with the Minoan civilization, sort of early second millennium BC, and Linear B is associated with the later Mycenaean civilization, which you may recall from the Iliad is one of the peoples that are led to Troy, right? So we're talking here Bronze Age, kind of Homeric times, not the time of Homer himself, but the time he's describing in the Iliad. And this is like 1500 to 1200 BC. They use this alphabet called Linear B. It's technically a syllabary, which means that each symbol represents a particular syllable, and it's written linearly, and we have been able to decipher it with some serious ambiguities and problems. Unlike Linear A, we can decipher Linear B. So this is very important because we get all these like receipts and stuff and descriptions of transactions from this Bronze Age civilization. It tells us a lot of stuff. And one of the things we find on some of these tablets is this compound ma-ka. And for a while, there was actually kind of a scholarly consensus that what this stood in for was ma-ga, which would give us ultimately the Greek words mater and Gaia, so Mother Earth, right? Mater Gaia. Now, these days, a lot of people have raised doubts about this. There's sort of serious difficulties in translating and interpreting texts like this, but if you believe that that's what that is, then we have a very, very early instance of Mother Earth worship. But you don't have to believe that to know that Gaia is a major figure in kind of some of the earliest Greek myths. If you go further beyond the Linear B stuff and you come around the time of Homer or thereabouts, the other major great Greek epic poet from most people think just after Homer is Hesiod. And Hesiod writes accounts of these myths that come down to us from Greek antiquity, one of which is the story of Uranos and Gaia, father sky, essentially, and mother earth, who gives birth to the Titans, and the Titans ultimately are going to spawn the race of gods, and the gods are the ones that preside over the world now. So again, there's this intuition in Greek mythology that Gaia, the Mother Earth, is sort of the origin of all things. In the Babylonian myths, in the Enuma Elish, for example, Tiamat is the mother and Apsu is the father, and ultimately in that story, Tiamat is going to be slain, destroyed by Marduk, or whoever ends up being the king of gods, and then her body is used to create the universe. So her breasts become the hills, and all of these other things. Rivers, streams flow out of her. So it's a kind of a violent, gory version of the story. And one of the things about paganism when you start to look into it is that there's always kind of a dark and gory side, because if the natural world is the supreme power, then yes, it gives us all these blessings, all these good things, but it can also be tremendously destructive and vengeful. And this is going to be a feature of the Mother Earth myth from very early on as well. And it stands to reason because we live in a world that gives us many beautiful things, exhibits a certain degree of order, but also exhibits a degree of pain, sorrow, and suffering. And again, the Christian monotheistic account of this and the Jewish account of it to some extent is like, that's kind of on us, that we're the weak link, we're the problem, it's us. But the pagan account of it is much more that we are in a world ruled by capricious or at least unintelligible deities. And the fact that there are many of them contributes to our sense that they don't actually answer to our sense of justice necessarily. They might, but this is what got Socrates in trouble, was asking these questions, right? Because basically the pagan idea is the world is what it is, and you are here, whether you like it or not necessarily because you're meant to be here, not because you're designed to kind of conquer the universe, but because you're just part of the natural world, and it's at the god's pleasure that you exist, but they don't owe you anything in particular. And this is kind of central to a lot of pagan mythologies, certainly as part of the Babylonian myth, where humans are created basically to work for the gods as slaves, essentially. But this idea that the mother is somehow the earth that we stand on, this is present in Babylon, it's present in Greece, it's also present in Norse to a certain extent. You have this figure, and it's a great Norse word. I'm going to try to pronounce it right, Jorð, and that's spelled J, O with an umlaut, R, and then F, ETH, which is a letter that kind of looks like a D with a little line through it, and it sounds like th. It's one of several lost letters that we lost in English that are pronounced th. And Jorð is the mother of Thor, the god of thunder. And she appears in, for example, the poetic and prosaic Edda, which is one compilation of Norse myths. Her name is directly related to the Proto-Germanic words erva and ervon, which give us ultimately our word eortha in Old English, which is ground or soil, and becomes our word earth. So even our English word earth is rooted in this idea of earth as mother, right? Jorð and eorth are kind of these words for expressing this sense that there is some maternal, matriarchal power at work in the soil and in the earth. And so all of these antique, ancient cultures give us some example of the idea that when you look out at the world, you see a character that probably can be fittingly associated with a mother figure, with some sort of mother deity. And the worship of her is very old. In Latin and in Roman civilization, it becomes the worship of Tellus or Terra. And there's an interesting kind of development that happens in these pagan societies where Tellus or Gaia or Tiamat or whichever of these kind of primordial figures becomes the Mother Earth figure is then kind of represented or carried forth into the pantheon of the present day. There's always this idea that the origins of the universe took place way beyond and before our present life. And our present life is governed by several generations on, the third gen gods, let's say, who emerge as the Olympians in the Greek version and so forth. And in the Greek and Roman version, there's Demeter and Ceres and Persephone, and usually it's a mother-daughter team who sort of manage the powers of the earth to bear fruit and grain and to fertilize and to produce all this food and stuff. And they're not themselves Mother Earth, but they basically become assimilated to this Mother Earth figure. But you do still also have these primordial cults of Tellus and Terra and Earth. And these endure and persist. And that's going to become important in just a second. But one last thing to mention as I'm doing this sort of comparative survey of the various different Mother Earths that have existed throughout time and space is that this isn't just a case of what you would call cultural exchange or syncretism. In other words, it's not that we're looking at one culture had the idea of Mother Earth and then spread it around somehow in some old-timey way, like maybe around the Mycenaean period. The Mycenaeans were known for their kind of aggressive trade and also conquest, and maybe they spread the idea. But that's not what we're looking at here, because you also have the same idea present in Native Americans, in American Indians, right? All these tribes that are still around, many of them now, but certainly were there when the explorers and conquerors came from the old world to the new world, had ideas about some sort of mother figure. There's a quotation from an old Algonquin legend: "Beneath the clouds lives the earth mother, from whom is derived the water of life, who at her bosom feeds plants, animals, and humans." And again, perfectly understandable, right? It makes perfect sense that you would describe the world this way. And we are now tempted to call this allegorical, but it's really pre-allegorical. It's just a way of describing the human experience of the world as sustained by the life of Earth. In Inca culture, you have this concept of Pachamama, who is maybe typically translated as Earth Mother, but maybe the best way of saying this is Cosmic Mother, Universe Mother. So maybe something along the lines of Tiamat from the Babylonian stories, that this is like, an entity whose very body kind of makes up the universe that we live in. And so we're not dealing with simply cultural transmission here. We're dealing with a very primitive and primal human impulse, human idea, that the world is run or indeed embodied in this mother figure that gives us things, that might demand things of us, and that certainly can squash us, can destroy us if she chooses, if she should desire. Now, you can say, if you want, that these are allegorical ways of describing the actual human experience, just metaphors or symbols for what we actually encounter in the natural world. But for the people that were first telling these myths, I don't think they felt or seemed allegorical at all. I think the people who wrote these myths down would have said this is a description, the most direct possible linguistic description of our experience of the world. We'll never know because we can't go back and interview them, and I'm talking even pre-Hesiod here. But still, this seems to me like the most natural way of understanding is that the basic instinct is simply to describe an encounter with an entity that you think you perceive in the world, and the ontological status of that entity, which is to say what we think is actually underlying that human experience, is a question for later generations to ask, which is important because later generations do quickly start asking this question. Okay, so if everybody around us, all of our forebears, all of our ancestors, seem to have had this intuition that there was an entity out there called Mother Earth, what was the experience they were having? What was the thing outside of them, beyond them, that they were encountering that they called by that name? And pretty soon you get a range of possible answers, one of which is it was a spirit, it was a higher entity. Another of which, from the Jewish and ultimately Christian tradition, is this was the remnant or the echo of God's creative power that was confused for a divine entity unto itself. In other words, when God created the world, he infused it with his spirit, his character, his life, and that got misinterpreted as a freestanding, independent entity called Mother Earth. But then there's the other way of looking at it, which is that this is simply a natural set of forces that can be described in purely material, rationalistic terms that occurs to us as if it were, in an allegorical sense, as if it were a being or a creature or a divine entity. And that explanation, too, is available at least to the Greek philosophers from very early on, because when you turn to the Hellenistic schools and the era that produced guys like Euhemerus, you do get these descriptions of the world as if it were simply a collection of atoms, and the gods, if they exist, are not anything like the personal beings that pagan mythology and folklore describes. These are just allegorical ways of describing the human experience of the simply natural world. And the most obvious place to turn here would be to the Epicureans. The Stoics give you kind of something like this, but the Epicureans really go all in for it when Epicurus himself says, there are gods, there are consciousnesses above and beyond ours, but it's ludicrous to think that they sit around in their free time micromanaging the weather, that we can pray to them or ask them for some sort of like rainfall or thunderclap, because we know that the rainfall and the plants growing and all of that comes out of perfectly understandable natural processes. Even if we don't know exactly how they work, we know we can describe them in certain material ways. And so when people talk about something like Mother Earth, they're really just talking about natura, nature, or in Greek, physis, which is actually understood from Aristotle, at least onward, as this system and set of spontaneous rules that don't need any consciousness to set them at work. And if you believe somebody like Leo Strauss, then actually physis and natura as a concept in the Greek mind goes back to Homer, and it maybe has an ambiguous status. Is nature a conscious being like Mother Earth, or is nature just a set of rules and laws that are more coldly rational, more impersonal? And in somebody like Epicurus or his greatest Roman interpreter, Lucretius, you get a very pagan description of the world that uses names like Venus or Natura and talks about them as if they were divine entities, but also is quite clear that really what's going on here, the underlying ontological phenomenon, is actually just natural things happening, atoms colliding, right? That's the whole point of Epicureanism, or the starting point of it, is this kind of Democritean or Leucippin idea that the world is made out of little chunks of matter and empty space. And that's what's primal. That's the bedrock of reality. And even the gods are made out of atoms, presumably, just in some other sphere and operating without any of the pain and difficulty that we struggle through because our atomic composition is so muddled and complicated. And so I want to read to you now a passage that I think is a precursor to the Bacon way of looking at things, which is that these are really, the gods, as people tend to talk about them, the pagan gods, are really just allegories. And like all Epicureanism, this is sort of before its time, ahead of its time. Like, you read this and you think, wow, this is exactly the way people think now. At the time, it was somewhat more abstruse and surprising to think this way. But this is from my own translation, actually, of Lucretius' poem De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, which opens with kind of a hymn to Venus, which is sort of interesting because Epicurus himself was very anti the gods, or he didn't want the gods to be invoked as descriptions of the world. But Lucretius describes Venus as this force that sort of holds the natural world together. And you get this sense that he's using these names from pagan mythology as like the most natural way of talking about what is actually a scientific or a material process. Kind of like, this is the language that you're used to talking about these things in. And so I'm going to use this language because we all know Venus. We all know basically her character and attributes. And now I'm going to reveal to you the actual material forces at work underneath these pagan mythological words. And so if you're interested in Epicureanism, I have a collection of some of these texts coming out. It's called Gateway to the Epicureans, and I'll drop the link in the show notes. It's on Amazon and coming out later this summer. So do go check that out. But I'm going to give you a little sneak preview here of my translation of one portion of Lucretius, in which he talks about basically Mother Earth, but talks about it in these purely atomistic materialist terms. This is from Book 2 of De Rerum Natura, translation by yours truly. We all spring forth from one celestial seed. One Father sheds his drops of liquid life onto the earth, our mother, who receives them, gestates, and gives birth to luscious fruits, exultant trees, and us, the human race. She generates the many forms of beasts and issues forth the sustenance they graze on, nourishing their bodies for a life of ease and procreation. These sweet gifts have rightly earned the earth the name of mother. All that comes from her returns again, and everything the air breathes forth returns to be absorbed again and find its place within the heavenly dominions. Lucretius is one of the great stylists of Latin literature, and I think, if I do say so myself, these translations are pretty good of the passages that I've included in Gateway to the Epicureans. But here you have a materialist way of talking about the world that still uses the name mother for earth, which is almost exactly what guys like Bacon are going to do in the scientific revolution. They're going to say, yeah, you can still describe the earth in all these ways. You can describe nature in all these sort of personified or anthropomorphized ways, as long as we understand that what we're dealing with here is rational processes that can be analyzed and described in kind of mathematical or quantifiable terms, experimental terms that we can test and verify by experiment. And so all of that energy, all of that sense of the world is populated with sprites and demons and fairies and spirits and all these gods. That all kind of gets transmuted into material science. And then the religious aspect of it, the worship part, gets placed outside of nature in the Christian God and this supernatural being that is literally above nature. And he has imbued the world with all of his intention and spirit and activity, and that's why the world can look as if it's populated with these other minds. But really, it's all the product of one mind who has invested the world with this physical logic. That's kind of the take of the scientific revolution. And what I want to propose to you is that that picture of the world actually makes more sense and accounts for more of the human experience than a purely materialist picture that gets rid of God altogether. That's actually not a sustainable way of looking at the world, because we do have this encounter with the world as rational and governed by laws that would have required a mind to exist, to come into being. And if they didn't come from supernature, if they didn't come from God of the Bible, then they're going to have to come from within the natural system itself, and nature is going to turn back into this kind of pagan entity. And now you start to see, exactly in the time when material science starts to rise and religion starts to wane, you start to see the return of this mother nature language as a dominant way of talking about the environment, the natural world, the world around us. And in America specifically, there's a really interesting dimension of this, which is that we have what you might call a pagan tradition very readily to hand all around us in the Native Americans, in the American Indians. Because since the natives had been living on Turtle Island, as we say, in what would become America, without evangelism, without Judeo-Christian scripture or religion, they participated in the forms of worship that come most naturally to man without that kind of revelation, without that scriptural worldview. And so they did have things like Pachamama and Mother Earth and the earth as mother. And that way of looking at the world had kind of endured much later than it had in Europe, where it had basically been eradicated by Christendom. And so now in America, we've got like Mother Earth worship and pagan Mother Earth ideas just thick on the ground, exactly as science starts to take hold of the imagination. So on the one hand, you have this hyper-modern thing of science and the advance of science and progress of material science and the kind of recession of monotheistic religion. And on the other hand, you have the oldest way of thinking about things in the world, which is Mother Earth. And you start to see the fusion of these two things in the hippie movement and in the early environmentalist movement as earth worship and the idea of Mother Earth kind of comes back, we think, as a way of describing what science reveals, right? If you talk to environmentalists, they'll say, if they use Mother Earth language, they'll say it's allegorical, right? It's a way of describing our relationship to the earth, and yet it's also freighted with this very not allegorical, quite sincere idea of Mother Earth that comes from Native American religion. And you see this in like drum circles and in hippie culture. There's this song my mother always used to tell me about. I don't know if you've ever heard the song "The Earth is Our Mother." It's almost like a chant. The earth is the mother, the sky is our father. And my mom would always tell me that when she was at camp, they would sing this song. It goes like, "The earth is our mother, we must take care of her." Yeah, do you know about this? Like, maybe you've heard it before. I knew about it through my mom, who like grew up in Berkeley and was part of these hippie circles and like went to camp and would sing this song, "The sky is our father." And as I started looking this song up, there's a kind of creepy thing about it, which is that nobody seems to quite know where this song comes from. Some people attribute it to the Hupa tribe of Northern California. Some people think it's a modern American folk song, but it is incorporated into this like neo-pagan way of looking at the world, that we have something called the Earth Mother that we have to take care of through science and through environmentalism and through all of these very modern things. And the ontological status of what's being described here is left kind of purposefully vague, so that when you have modern, like, white American liberals chanting in this kind of Native American way about the earth is our mother, if you stop to ask them, like, do you really mean that? Like, is there actually an entity called Mother Earth with ideas and thoughts? I think the answer to that question would be kind of confused. Like, some new agey types would really go in for just like, this is Mother Earth. Yes, absolutely. She has feelings, she has thoughts, whatever, man, like she knows you. But others would be much more kind of ambiguous about it and think, well, this is sort of a useful story or image or depiction of the truth that we all live in this interconnected ecological web and we need to take care of it. And this is where you start to see the emergence of what I'm calling an allegregore, because it's technically allegorical. It's not really like pagan worship in that it's not a description of an entity that everybody involved thinks exists, and yet you have to ask the question, how would it be different if we really did believe that there is this earth spirit at play here called Mother Nature? And how is it different from the way early pagans described their experience and understood their experience? And gradually over time, as the Christian God recedes, the distance between the quote-unquote allegorical interpretation of modern paganism and Mother Earth and the literal interpretation starts to collapse. And you start to think, well, is it more exact and economical and direct to say, well, we're really talking about the environment and it's actually science and it's actually this kind of physical thing? Or would it be more simple and direct to say, just this is the return of earth worship? This is our sense that the material processes, the science we use to describe the world, is imbued with more than simply physical reality, and we're in a relationship here with some kind of consciousness. And if that consciousness is not the Christian God, it's going to take on the shape and the form of the pagan gods, one of which is Mother Earth, and Mother Earth as like a spirit that pagan civilizations from North America all the way to ancient Greece and ancient Babylon have always felt was sort of present in the world. And so now you're starting to see like really true allegregorical Mother Earth worship come to the fore of culture. Like Jamie Lee Curtis, of all people, the actress, has a graphic novel about Mother Nature. The most stark example of this, the most striking example of this, was when Apple, the corporation whom you all know as the people that made your phone probably or your computer, put out this PSA or this, I don't know, PR campaign about how they were meeting their sustainability requirements. And they had set for themselves all these goals about certain metrics they were going to hit and certain levels of sustainability they were going to meet. But the way they chose to dramatize this was for Octavia Spencer, the actress, to come in to an Apple board meeting with like Tim Cook, the CEO, and all these other people, and portray Mother Nature. And Mother Nature has demands. She wants certain sacrifices to be made. She wants you to cut back on your usage of certain things, or else she will punish you. Right? There's that kind of gory side of paganism coming back again, that there will be like lightning that comes from the sky and there will be all these problems. And Mother Nature wants to know that you are making the right sacrifices so that sustainability can flourish and prosper. And we are sort of subordinates on Earth to Mother Nature, right? Whom we have to propitiate with all these sacrifices because it's her powers and her desires and her wants that are ultimately more important. Now, this was a real PR campaign. You can go look this up and find a video of it on YouTube. Mother Nature wants a status update was, I think, the slogan. And so here was this person, this personification of Mother Nature. If you asked Apple's PR team what they thought they were up to, I'm sure, I have no doubt that they would say, well, this is like, what are you, dense? Like, this is a joke. This is a dramatization, a depiction of what we're about at Apple and our sustainability goals. But here's my question about that, right? This is such an accurate depiction of what you think people want out of environmentalism, right? This is an almost exact portrayal, mimetic embodiment, dramatization, whatever you want to call it, allegory, for the way you think people really do relate to the environment. That is, you think there are all these people out there buying Apple phones who do believe that if we don't perform certain actions, we will be punished by nature. Now, they would give a materialist account of that. They would say, well, it's because we'll put too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that will mindlessly and without any intention generate warming or trap greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth. And they would be able to give, the more sophisticated ones would be able to give a perfectly non-intentional, non-divine description of how this all works. Except that the way that we relate to that materialist idea of the world is in a form of sacrifice that is perfectly depicted and encapsulated in this Mother Nature routine, in the idea that there is a spirit out there that's going to punish us. And this is why, for example, there is so much passionate resistance to the idea of nuclear power, which would solve a lot of the problems that environmentalists claim to care about. But when somebody like my friend Emmett Penny raises this and brings this up, he gets like furious pushback, almost like anger from the environmentalist lobby, because nuclear power is materially successful at answering the problems, but it's not religiously or theologically successful because it's dirty, it's unclean, it's been portrayed as somehow offensive to Mother Nature. And so I ask again, is the Mother Nature Apple ad an allegory? Is it a joke? Is it a sort of metaphor or image? Or is the materialist description actually a deflection from the metaphorical reality, that the metaphor more precisely and articulately demonstrates what the people involved actually believe. What they actually think is that there is an entity out there called nature, which will visit destruction upon us if we don't make the proper sacrifices. That's an allegregore. That's when your allegory or your ironical or your humorous way of describing your relationship to these entities outside of you takes on such a life of its own that it actually starts to feel as if the allegory is the reality and the material, scientific, rationalist description is just a cover or a front. And so the position of the literal and the allegorical interpretation kind of flips and swaps until you've got the return of the pagan gods. And that's a more exact and even perhaps literal way of describing what's going on here, which makes perfect sense when you realize that actually science was always a way of secularizing the pagan gods. That was part of its purpose. But that happened at a time when people had another god that they could worship, namely the God of the Christian and Jewish scriptures. If that God recedes from your consciousness, you won't stop worshiping. You'll just start worshiping something else. And the most natural place to look will be in the natural sciences, and the gods of the pagan world will return in allegregorical form. I'm going to keep on this theme because I find it so rich and fascinating, and Mother Nature is not the only example of it. She's just the most kind of immediate and obvious example of it. But once you see this, cannot unsee. I would be very interested if you guys want to write in with potential examples of allegregores that you've observed in the world. I'm going to propose some others, but I think Mother Nature is a really great place to start as we start to talk about the return of our pagan world. And ultimately, I want to talk about how the medieval way of looking at things might help us to kind of grapple with this or get past and beyond our neo-paganism. But for now, let's do a mailbag question. Mailbag questions come to me through Substack, which you can reach at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. All subscribers can send me DMs or emails, whether you're a free subscriber or a paid subscriber, just asking whatever question you'd like to ask. So do sign up there to be part of that. My mailbag question this week is very simple, but very provocative. It's from Stephen. He says, when you talk to God, addressing me, I suppose, when you talk to God, do you say you or y'all? And I presume that what Stephen means by this is, do you think of God as multiple or singular, given that the Christian idea of God is a trinity, 3 in 1, 3 persons, but one God? And I think this is not something Christians typically think that much about, but it's genuinely worth considering. Do we relate to God as one entity or 3? Obviously, one of the ancient accusations against Christianity is that it's basically polytheist, that all of this stuff I'm talking about with paganism could apply to Christianity too. That's there in like Origen's Contra Celsum. It's there in Arabic accusations, Muslim accusations against Christianity. And there's a sort of a point to it when you think about the fact that God as having multiplicities within him, despite being one coherent entity, is baked into the Hebrew scriptures as well as the Christian scriptures. And the most famous example of this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, which in English is translated as, "And God said, let us make man in our image." In the Hebrew, this is even more striking because the Hebrew word Elohim, which we translate as God, and can mean not just the real God, the true God of the Bible, but also the rival gods, the idols, the demons. Sometimes the angels are described as gods. So really any supernatural entity that we perceive in the world as higher than us. The word Elohim is actually plural in form. Im, that im ending in Hebrew, is like es in English. It means a plural noun. And so it looks like the shape of the word Elohim is like the shape of the word gods, not like the shape of the word God. But, and this makes things even more complicated, it's conjugated. That is, it functions grammatically as a singular. So you use singular verbs to describe or to attach to a plural noun. So it would be kind of like in English saying, and gods says, right? You would typically say gods say, but instead in Hebrew, you basically say gods says. So you have a singular verb and a plural noun. And this is very striking here in verse 26 because the Hebrew is Vayomer Elohim, and God said, plural God, singular said, Vayomer Elohim na ese Adam b'tsalmenu. So let us make God in our image. And those are plural, right? First person plural, let us make God. Na esse is a plural, let us make. But you have this singular God. And so if you wanted to give a kind of naturalist, ground up, materialist description of how this would happen, or a historicist description of this, and people have said this, what you have here, some scholars speculate, is originally a myth of multiple gods, a whole council of the gods, perhaps, which is discernible in the background of the Hebrew Bible, and certainly was part of the cultural context of the Hebrew Bible. You had many, many gods, kind of in the pagan world, and God, Yahweh, Adonai, emerges as the one God who eclipses all the others and ultimately delegitimizes all the others. But first you have a culture that would have been worshiping many gods and is now bundling up all of its different god characters into one character. And so you have the remnant of that in this text would be kind of a historicist or materialist interpretation. A Christian interpretation, and this is also something people often say, is no, God is Trinitarian from the beginning, that Scripture is so prophetic and perfect that even in its first chapter, it gives you a picture of a God who is singular in his actions, that has one mind, one action, but is multiple in his persons. That is, there are 3 persons in God. Like, who is God speaking to when he says, let us make? Well, one way of understanding it is it's God the Father speaking to God the Son through God the Spirit, right? That the Trinitarian structure is already there. Some people also say this is God speaking to his own wisdom, because wisdom is there at the beginning in Proverbs, right? But there is a kind of a mystical interpretation of this passage that would say, no, it's not that people first believed in multiple gods and then they kind of bundled it all up into one God. It's that God was always dictating, essentially, his nature to the scripture authors who intuited that there was multiplicity and unity already in the divine. My answer to this is kind of the GIF from online where it's the little girl and she says, why can't we have both? In other words, why isn't it possible that our sense of multiplicity in the pantheon, our pagan belief, or the natural human way of relating to the world as embodying multiple different divine agencies, why isn't that a kind of distorted premonition of the truth that Scripture ultimately and gradually reveals or draws out of this natural human relationship to the divine, to show that God, yes, can be experienced or known through his three different persons, is essentially tripartite, triune, and yet also is one coherent entity that can be known in the character of God. And that's why it's important that it's this verse that gives us the first pluralization of God, because he's making us in his image. And we too know that we have a heart, a mind, a body, right? These different aspects of us that nevertheless are, though each of them is us, all of them are kind of bound together in one coherent unity. And why is this important for answering Stephen's question? Well, the first truth that any Christian has to know is the truth that God emphasizes and drives home in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, which is Shema Israel Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. And that's because the natural state of man, the pagan state of man, is to imagine the divine as multifarious, as kind of operating in all these different ways, and there are many different gods. And it's in the Hebrew Bible, against that backdrop, that you get this insistence on the oneness of God. And so we always, I think, have to be reminding ourselves that God is one, because our natural experience of the world might kind of push us away from that, unless we have this revelation that God is one. So first and foremost, we talk to God as one. So I use you, singular, to talk to God and when I pray. But that doesn't mean that I don't have an awareness of the multiple persons of the Trinity. And maybe the most traditional way, I think, of talking about this, although not every Christian church is good about driving this home, is that when you pray, you're praying to God the Father. That is the God who is above and beyond all time and space. But it's in the person of Jesus that God is revealed. So Jesus opens the route for you to pray to God the Father. And it's God the Spirit that inspires, right, literally breathes into you the idea and the right form of praying. So maybe the best way of saying what's the Christian's relationship to the Trinity in prayer, well, it's not that you're talking to the whole Trinity. It's actually that you're entering into the Trinity, into communion with the Trinity, as a way of praying to God the Father. Because God the Father is the God that I think most monotheists have known from the beginning, right? And it's only in Christian theology and revelation that we understand that God the Father also has his representative on earth in Jesus and his mediator or paraclete in the Holy Spirit. So I would suggest, like, you're entering into the company of the Trinity, but you're talking to God the Father when you pray. C.S. Lewis has this beautiful image that if God is above us, God the Father is above us as we pray, God the Son in Jesus is beside us as the archetypal image of our prayer, that is how our humanity can be in communion with God, and God the Spirit is behind us, like with his hand on our shoulder, coaching us on. So I use you singular, not y'all, but that's not because God isn't three in one, or because all of these fascinating realities aren't there in Genesis, but because that's the right description of our relationship to the Trinity. Not that we're speaking to the whole Trinity in prayer, but that we're speaking to God the Father in communion with the Trinity. And the Trinity has entered into a relationship with us because we are in the image of the Trinity, and we speak in that image to God the Father. I hope that's fun and interesting and maybe even helpful for your prayer life. I have one last thing to talk to you about, and that's my weekly segment called I Maked This. I do other stuff besides this podcast, kind of a lot of other stuff, in fact, and I want you to have access to it if it's of interest to you. This week, since I've read to you from my translation of Lucretius, I want to commend to you The Gateway to the Epicureans, which is available on Amazon for pre-order, and which makes, I think, a really nice companion to the other book that I have coming coming out this summer, which is Light of the Mind, Light of the World. And that's a book of my own, not a book of translations. And both of them are coming out this summer, but in particular, I haven't really talked that much about the Gateway. I'm proofreading it now, looking at the proofs of it. I'm excited for you to get your hands on that too. And I have an essay that introduces Epicureanism and kind of makes the argument that Epicureanism has become our default philosophy, which you maybe got a flavor for in this episode. But for a long time, I've been thinking, and this is something that John Adams, of all people, kind of observed in a letter that I include in the collection, that Epicureanism has become so mainstream we don't even recognize it as a philosophy. We just think of it as like the way things are. But it is a philosophy, and it pays to come to know it, because when you come to understand Epicureanism, you kind of come to understand us, ourselves, our predicament, our problem. So that's Gateway to the Epicureans. Go check that out on Amazon. Don't forget, every now and then should make this plug, I think, to share the show, rate it 5 stars wherever you're listening, tell your friends about it. It really helps to grow and get it boosted in the algorithm. So grateful for all of you for being here. We're going to keep talking about allegregores, and I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.